Sometimes the cruelest moments in life reveal the deepest truths about human kindness. Every person deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not mocked for what they cannot change. At Fort Bridger's auction yard, men gathered to trade livestock. When Jake Kinley dragged his sister Reba forward as a joke, the crowd erupted in laughter. She stood 6 feet tall with a full beard and hands stronger than most men. They called her Bear Jaw and treated her like a spectacle. But Gideon Bell, a poor cowboy with nothing but his horse, saw something different. He saw a woman who had survived the wilderness, who possessed rare strength and dignity. When he stepped forward and offered genuine respect instead of mockery, everything changed. What happened next would become frontier legend and prove that true love sees beyond appearances. How could one simple act of kindness transform 2 broken lives and shame an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bridger's dusty main street, where the scent of wood smoke mixed with the earthy smell of livestock and leather. This was Wyoming territory in 1869, where the railroad had brought both opportunity and trouble to the frontier. Men came here to trade, to drink, and to forget whatever had driven them west. Some came running from the law, others from memories they couldn't shake. Most came looking for something they'd lost along the way. Reba Kinley had been awake since before dawn, as was her custom. At 43, she possessed the kind of strength that came from a lifetime of surviving where others perished. Her weathered hand scarred from countless encounters with wild animals, frostbite, and the daily brutality of mountain living moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared coffee over the small fire outside their camp. The full beard that covered her chin and jaw caught the morning light, auburn streaked with premature grey that spoke of harsh winters and harder choices. Jake Kinley stirred in his bedroll, groaning as consciousness brought the familiar ache of too much whiskey and too little sleep. At 47, he had the hollow look of a man who'd gambled away everything that mattered and now survived on the scraps of what remained. His sister had been his meal ticket for the past 5 years, ever since their father died, and left them with nothing but debts and a reputation for being the oddest family in 3 territories. "Coffee's ready," Reba said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She'd learned early that in the wilderness, hesitation meant death, and that lesson had shaped everything about her, from the way she moved, with purposeful economy, to the way she spoke only when words were necessary. Jake sat up, running dirty fingers through his thinning hair. "We need to talk about today, Reba." She didn't look at him, instead focusing on the careful ritual of cleaning her skinning knife-ear blade worn smooth from decades of use, its handle carved from elk antler and wrapped in leather strips darkened by blood and time. This knife had seen her through the worst moments of her life. The winter she'd survived alone in a cave for 3 months, the spring she'd fought off a grizzly bear to protect their food cache, the countless times she'd dressed game to keep them from starving. "I know what today is," she replied. "Same as every month. We trade what we can and move on." But Jake's gambling debts had grown beyond what pelts and meat could cover. 3 months ago, he'd lost their pack horses to a card sharp from Cheyenne. 2 months ago, their winter supplies had gone to cover a bet on a horse race. Last month, he'd promised something he had no right to promise, and now the reckoning had come. "It ain't the same, Reba. I need you to understand that." She finally looked at him, her green eyes, the one feature that reminded anyone who cared to notice that she was, indeed, a woman holding a mixture of weariness and warning. "What did you do this time, Jake?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 men rode into their camp, led by a thick-set man with silver hair and expensive boots. These weren't the usual traders or drifters who frequented Fort Bridger. These men had the look of serious money and serious intentions. "Mr. Kinley," the leader said, dismounting with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "I trust you remember our conversation from last month." Jake scrambled to his feet, his face pale beneath several days' worth of stubble. "Mr. Carruthers, I can explain." "Explanations are expensive, Mr. Kinley. And you're already in debt to me for more than you can ever repay." Carruthers' eyes moved to Reba, taking in her unusual appearance with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everything as potential profit or loss. "Is this the collateral you mentioned?" Reba stood slowly, her hand never moving far from the knife at her belt. She'd survived this long by recognizing danger when it approached, and these men carried trouble like a scent. "Jake, what collateral?" "Now, Reba, don't get upset. It's just temporary, until I can get back on my feet." "Your brother has wagered you, Miss Kinley," Carruthers interrupted, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant news. "Specifically, he's promised that you'll work off his debts in whatever capacity I see fit." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sounds of Fort Bridger coming to life, merchants setting up their stalls, horses being led to water. The eternal conversation of men trying to make deals that would keep them alive another day. Reba's voice, when it came, was deadly quiet. "Jake, tell me you didn't." But his silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, 50 yards away, Gideon Bell was tending to his horse with the careful attention of a man who understood that his life might depend on the animal's health and loyalty. At 38, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned that true strength didn't need to announce itself. His clothes were worn but clean, his boots resoled more times than he cared to count, his hat shaped by years of weather and wear. Gideon had been drifting for the better part of a decade, picking up work where he could find it, breaking horses, driving cattle, sometimes wearing a badge when towns needed temporary law and order. He'd never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots, partly by choice and partly because the world seemed designed to keep men like him moving. He'd arrived in Fort Bridger 3 days ago with his horse, his saddle, and $17 to his name. The horse was worth more than everything else he owned combined, but he'd never considered selling her. Some things weren't for sale, no matter how desperate a man became. As he worked, he found himself watching the drama unfolding at the Kinley camp. He'd heard talk about Jake Kinley, how the man's gambling had gotten progressively worse, how he'd been borrowing money from increasingly dangerous sources. But Gideon's attention was drawn more to the woman. Even from a distance, Reba Kinley was impossible to ignore. Her height alone would have made her stand out in any crowd, but it was something else that caught his attention: the way she carried herself, like someone who'd earned every inch of the space she occupied. He'd known men who moved with that kind of quiet authority, usually after they'd survived something that would have broken lesser souls. The morning progressed with the usual frontier rhythm: horses being traded, goods being bartered, men making the kind of casual conversation that revealed nothing important while negotiating deals that might mean the difference between prosperity and starvation. But underneath the familiar routine, tension was building like storm clouds on the horizon. By midday, word had spread through Fort Bridger's small community that something unusual was about to happen at the auction yard. Jake Kinley, drunk and desperate, was making increasingly wild claims about what he was willing to trade. Some men laughed, others shook their heads in disgust. A few made quiet bets about how far the man would actually go. Gideon found himself drawn toward the auction yard, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Perhaps it was the same instinct that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work, the ability to sense when a situation was about to turn ugly and someone might need help. The auction yard was a simple affair, a wooden platform surrounded by split-rail fencing, where men gathered monthly to trade everything from cattle to household goods. Today, the crowd was larger than usual, drawn by rumors and the peculiar magnetism of impending disaster. Jake Kinley stood on the platform, swaying slightly from the whiskey he'd been consuming since breakfast. His sister stood beside him, her face a mask of controlled fury and deep shame. She'd removed her hat, revealing hair the same auburn as her beard, braided and pinned in a style that suggested she understood feminine customs, even if she chose not to follow them. "Gentlemen," Jake began, his voice carrying the false confidence of a man trying to convince himself as much as his audience. "I've got something unique to offer today. Something you ain't never seen before." The crowd murmured with anticipation and growing unease. Even by frontier standards, there were certain lines that decent men didn't cross, and Jake Kinley was clearly approaching one of those boundaries. Gideon positioned himself near the back of the crowd, close enough to see and hear everything but far enough away to avoid being drawn into whatever was about to unfold. His weathered hands rested easily at his sides, but his eyes were alert, cataloguing faces and positions with the automatic assessment of someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. As Jake continued his increasingly desperate pitch, Gideon's attention remained fixed on Reba. Despite the humiliating circumstances, she held herself with remarkable dignity. Her green eyes swept the crowd not with the desperation of someone pleading for rescue, but with the calculating gaze of someone taking measure of potential threats. This was a woman who'd survived, Gideon realized. Whatever else happened here today, she'd find a way to endure it, just as she'd apparently endured everything else life had thrown at her. But survival and dignity weren't the same thing, and he could see the cost of this public humiliation in the tight lines around her eyes and the careful control of her breathing. The crowd's laughter was building now, feeding on itself the way mobs always did. Men who might have shown individual kindness were becoming part of something uglier, something that would leave everyone involved a little less human than they'd been before. That's when Gideon Bell made a decision that would change two lives forever. He started walking toward the platform, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each deliberate step. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he intended to do. He only knew that what was happening here was wrong, and that sometimes a man had to act on principle, even when he couldn't afford the consequences. The leather-bound journal in his saddlebags, filled with his private thoughts and observations about human nature, would later record this moment as the day he stopped running from life and decided to stand still long enough to build something worth keeping. But that entry would be written months later, after he understood what he'd started with that first step toward the auction platform. For now, he simply walked forward, guided by the same quiet certainty that had carried him through every important decision of his adult life. Behind him, his horse nickered softly, as if sensing that their long journey together was about to take an unexpected turn. The moment Jake Kinley's words left his mouth, the entire auction yard fell into a silence so complete that the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer seemed to echo like thunder. "Take this mountain woman for free, poor cowboy," he slurred, gesturing toward his sister with the exaggerated flourish of a man trying to cover his shame with bravado. "She ain't much to look at, but she's strong as an ox and twice as stubborn." The crowd's reaction came in waves, first shocked silence, then nervous laughter, then the building roar of men who'd found an outlet for every frustration and disappointment that frontier life had delivered. They pointed at Reba's beard, made crude jokes about her size, and speculated about what kind of desperate man would ever want such a woman. Reba stood motionless on the platform, her face revealing nothing of the storm raging inside her. She'd endured mockery before it was the price of being different in a world that demanded conformity, but this public humiliation cut deeper than anything she'd previously experienced. Her brother hadn't just betrayed her trust. He'd reduced her to a spectacle, a joke to be laughed at by men who wouldn't survive a single winter in the mountains that had shaped her. From the back of the crowd, Gideon Bell watched the scene unfold with growing disgust. He'd seen enough cruelty in his 38 years to recognize it in all its forms, but there was something particularly ugly about this moment. The way grown men were taking pleasure in another person's humiliation, the way they felt entitled to judge and mock someone whose strength they couldn't match and whose endurance put their own to shame. As the laughter reached its peak, Jake raised his hands for silence. "Come now, boys, I'm serious here. She can hunt, track, dress game, and work harder than any 3 men. Hell, she once killed a grizzly bear with nothing but a knife and her bare hands." His voice carried a desperate edge now, as if he was trying to convince himself that what he was doing had some justification beyond his own weakness. Maybe we should put her in the circus instead, someone called out, generating another wave of laughter. Circus don't need a bearded lady, another voice replied. They already got one in Denver. The crowd's amusement was feeding on itself now, growing uglier with each comment. Reba's hands remained steady at her sides, but Gideon could see the slight tremor in her jaw, the way her breathing had become more controlled. She was holding herself together through sheer force of will, the same way he'd seen soldiers do when faced with situations that threatened to break their spirit. That's when Gideon Bell made his move. He stepped forward, his boots striking the wooden platform with quiet authority. The crowd's laughter began to fade as men turned to see who was interrupting their entertainment. Gideon removed his hat, revealing graying hair that caught the afternoon sun, and approached Reba with the respectful bearing of a man addressing a lady of quality. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet yard. "My name is Gideon Bell, and I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted Jake's announcement. This was the deep stillness that comes when people witness something they don't understand, something that challenges their assumptions about how the world works. Reba looked at him for the first time, really looked at him, taking in his weathered face, his steady brown eyes, the careful way he held himself that spoke of respect rather than mockery. "You don't know me," she said quietly. "I know enough," Gideon replied. "I know you're strong enough to survive where others would perish. I know you've got dignity that won't break, no matter what anyone says or does. And I know you deserve better than being made into a joke for these men's entertainment." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring, his mother's wedding band, carried for 20 years like a promise he'd never thought he'd be able to keep. "This was my mother's," he said, holding it out to her. "She was a good woman who saw the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. I think she'd approve of you wearing it." The crowd began to murmur now, uncertainty replacing their earlier amusement. This wasn't going according to the script they'd expected. The poor cowboy was supposed to laugh along with the joke, not treat it as if it were a genuine proposal. Jake Kinley swayed on his feet, his face cycling through confusion, relief, and growing panic as he realized what was actually happening. "Now hold on there, mister. This was just meant to be—" "A joke?" Gideon's voice carried a edge of steel now. "Your sister's dignity is a joke to you. Her worth as a human being is something to laugh about." Reba continued to study Gideon's face, searching for the trap, the hidden cruelty, the inevitable moment when he too would reveal that this was all part of some elaborate jest. But his eyes held steady, and she found herself remembering what genuine respect looked like, something she hadn't seen directed toward her in longer than she cared to remember. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are," Gideon replied. "Because strength like yours shouldn't be mocked, it should be honored. And because I've been drifting for too many years, looking for something worth staying still for. Maybe it's time I stopped running." The crowd was growing restless now, sensing that their entertainment was transforming into something more serious than they'd bargained for. Some men began to drift away, uncomfortable with the way the situation was developing. Others pressed closer, drawn by the same instinct that makes people stare at accidents. Reverend Matthews, Fort Bridger's part-time preacher and full-time merchant, had been watching from the edge of the crowd. Now he found himself caught between duty and discretion, called upon to officiate at what might be either a genuine wedding or an elaborate practical joke. The man's weathered face showed his internal struggle as he approached the platform. "Mr. Bell," he said carefully, "are you serious about this proposal?" "Dead serious, Reverend, if the lady will have me." All eyes turned to Reba. She looked at the gold ring in Gideon's outstretched hand, then at his face, then at the crowd of men who'd been laughing at her just moments before. Her entire life had been a series of choices between dignity and survival, between standing up for herself and avoiding trouble. This moment felt different, like a crossroads where the path she chose would determine not just her immediate future, but who she would become. "I've got nothing to offer you," she said quietly. "No dowry, no prospects, no—" "You've got yourself," Gideon interrupted. That's more than enough. She took the ring, feeling its weight in her palm, not just the gold, but the promise it represented, the leap of faith it would require from both of them. When she looked up, she found Gideon's eyes waiting for her, patient and steady and completely serious. "Yes," she said, the word carrying across the auction yard like a bell. "Yes, I'll marry you." The crowd erupted into chaos, men cheering, others protesting, most simply stunned by the unexpected turn of events. Jake Kinley staggered backward, his face showing the full realization of what he'd set in motion. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat nervously and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony, his voice carrying the authority of his office even as his hands shook slightly. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." "This is insane," someone called out. "You can't be serious about marrying Bearjaw Kinley." Gideon turned toward the voice, his expression calm, but his posture suggesting that further interruptions would not be welcome. "Her name is Reba," he said quietly, "and she's about to become my wife. I'd appreciate it if you'd show her the respect she deserves." The ceremony proceeded with increasing solemnity as the crowd realized they were witnessing something genuine rather than an elaborate jest. When Reverend Matthews asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence stretched long enough to hear the wind moving through the cottonwood trees that lined the nearby creek. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," the Reverend concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Bell, you may kiss your bride." Gideon stepped closer to Reba, his movements careful and respectful. "May I?" he asked quietly, seeking permission even in this moment that belonged to them both. She nodded, and he leaned forward to press a gentle kiss to her lips, not the rough, claiming kiss the crowd might have expected, but something tender and promising, the kind of kiss that spoke of new beginnings rather than conquest. When they separated, Reba's eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," Gideon replied, "for saying yes, for taking a chance on a stranger, for being brave enough to start over." As the crowd began to disperse, some men shaking their heads in confusion, others placing bets on how long the unlikely marriage would last, Gideon helped his new wife down from the platform. Jake Kinley had disappeared, slipping away in the chaos like the coward he'd always been. "Where do we go from here?" Reba asked as they walked toward Gideon's horse. "Wherever we want," he replied. "We've got the rest of our lives to figure it out." The morning after their wedding, Gideon and Reba sat beside a small campfire 3 miles outside Fort Bridger, sharing coffee and the awkward silence of two strangers who'd committed themselves to a lifetime together, on the strength of a single moment's courage. The beaded medicine pouch at Reba's side, a gift from an old Shoshone woman who taught her the ways of mountain herbs and healing, seemed to catch the early light. Its intricate patterns telling stories of survival and wisdom passed down through generations. "I've been thinking about heading north," Gideon said finally, poking at the fire with a stick. "Up toward the Tetons. There's good land up there, away from the main trails. A man could build something that would last." Reba nodded slowly, her weathered hands wrapped around her tin cup. "I know that country. Spent 2 winters up there with the old woman who taught me about plants and medicines. It's hard land but fair if you understand its ways. You think we could make it work? The two of us, I mean." She studied his face in the firelight, still searching for signs of regret or second thoughts. "Depends on what you're looking for. If you want an easy life, you married the wrong woman in the wrong place." Gideon smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Easy never taught anybody anything worth knowing. I'm more interested in real." They broke camp as the sun climbed higher, loading their few possessions onto Gideon's horse and setting out on foot toward the mountains that rose like promises on the northern horizon. Reba had insisted on walking. She'd spent most of her adult life on her own 2 feet, and she saw no reason to change that now, even if it meant keeping pace with a mounted man. As they traveled, they began the delicate process of learning each other's rhythms and habits. Gideon discovered that Reba moved through the wilderness with an economy of motion that spoke of deep familiarity. She read tracks in the dust, identified edible plants along the trail, and seemed to know instinctively when weather was changing hours before clouds appeared in the sky. "That's mountain mahogany," she said, pointing to a shrub growing on a rocky slope. "Tea from the bark will ease a man's chest when he's coughing. And those berries there, they're good eating, but only after the first frost. Before that, they'll twist your gut something fierce." Gideon listened carefully, filing away information that might mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving in the country they were heading toward. His own knowledge ran more toward horses, cattle, and the ways of towns and settlements. Together, they might actually have what it took to build a life in the mountains. On their second day of travel, they encountered another group heading south, a family with 2 wagons and several children, clearly struggling with a broken axle and the kind of despair that comes when disaster strikes far from help. The man looked up as they approached, his face cycling through hope, confusion, and something approaching fear as he took in Reba's unusual appearance. "Folks," Gideon said, tipping his hat respectfully, "looks like you've got some trouble there." The man, middle-aged, soft-handed, clearly more comfortable with ledger books than repair work, gestured helplessly at the broken wagon. "Axle snapped this morning. We're supposed to meet a supply train in Laramie, but at this rate." He trailed off, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his problem. Reba was already examining the brake, her experienced hands testing the wood and assessing what could be salvaged. "Got any spare timber?" she asked. "Some," the man replied uncertainly, "but I don't know how to—" "I do." She looked at Gideon. "You got tools in your kit?" He nodded, already unpacking the basic implements that any traveling man carried: hammer, saw, draw knife, and an assortment of nails and leather strips that could serve a dozen purposes. For the next 3 hours, Reba worked with the focused intensity of someone who understood that competence was often the difference between life and death. She carved new spokes from seasoned oak, fitted them with the precision of a master craftsman, and reinforced the repair with strips of rawhide that would hold even under the stress of mountain travel. The man's wife, who'd been watching from a distance with their children clustered around her skirts, finally approached as the work neared completion. "I've never seen a woman work with wood like that," she said, her voice carrying genuine admiration mixed with curiosity. "My pa taught me," Reba replied, not looking up from her work. "Said a person ought to be able to fix what breaks, whether it's made of wood, metal, or bone." When the repair was finished, the man tried to press money on them, but Gideon waved it away. "Just pass the kindness along when you get the chance," he said. As they resumed their own journey, the man called after them, "Thank you, both of you. I hope—" He paused, struggling for words. "I hope you find what you're looking for up there." "That was well done," Gideon said, when they were out of earshot. Reba shrugged. "Wagon needed fixing. I knew how to fix it. It was more than that, and you know it. You could have walked past, let them figure it out for themselves." She was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "Old Shoshone woman told me something once. Said every skill you have is a gift you're supposed to share. Keep it to yourself, and it dies with you. Share it, and it lives on in the people you help." They made camp that evening beside a creek that ran clear and cold from the mountains ahead. As Reba prepared their simple meal-salt pork, beans, and wild greens she'd gathered along the trail, Gideon found himself watching her with growing respect. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned to depend on her own capabilities, but there was nothing selfish about her competence. She shared her knowledge freely, taught without condescension, and approached problems with the practical wisdom of someone who'd faced real hardship and survived. "Can I ask you something?" he said as they sat by their fire, the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Reckon you can ask anything you want. We're married now. What made you say yes yesterday? Really, I mean. You could have told me to go to hell, walked away, started over somewhere else on your own." Reba stirred the beans thoughtfully, steam rising from the pot between them. "Been on my own most of my life," she said finally. "Learned to depend on myself, trust my own judgment, make my own way. But there's a difference between being independent and being alone. One makes you strong, the other just makes you tired. She looked at him across the fire, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. You didn't see me as a joke yesterday. Didn't see me as something broken that needed fixing, or something strange that needed explaining. You just saw me and decided I was worth taking a chance on. Been a long time since anybody looked at me that way. And now I'm thinking maybe it's time I stopped being so afraid of letting somebody else care about what happens to me. Might be nice to have someone to share the load with, someone who won't run off when things get difficult. Gideon nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd actually said. I've been running for a long time myself. Different reasons maybe, but running all the same. Yesterday, when I saw you standing there taking all that mockery with such dignity, I realized I was tired of running. Tired of being alone with my own thoughts. Tired of never building anything that would last longer than the next job or the next town. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek murmur over its rocky bed and the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the prairie. The mountains ahead looked black against the star-filled sky, mysterious and promising and full of possibilities for people brave enough to face them together. We'll make it work, Reba said quietly, more to herself than to him. Yes, Gideon agreed. We will. 5 days into their journey north, they found the valley that would become their home. It lay nestled between two ridges, like a secret kept by the mountains themselves, a natural meadow, with a clear stream running through its center, stands of aspen and pine providing timber and shelter, and grass rich enough to support livestock through the growing season. More importantly, it was far enough from established trails that they could build a life without constant interference from the outside world. What do you think? Gideon asked, dismounting and letting his horse drink from the stream. Reba walked the perimeter of the meadow, reading the land with the same attention she'd given the broken wagon axle. She noted the way water flowed, identified the prevailing wind patterns, found the spots where snow would drift deepest in winter and where the sun would linger longest in summer. It's good land, she said finally, protected from the worst weather, water year-round, and enough timber to build whatever we need. That afternoon, they began the work that would define the next phase of their lives together. Gideon's experience with construction ran mostly to temporary shelters and quick repairs, but his craftsmanship was solid, and his willingness to learn made up for what he lacked in specialized knowledge. Reba's understanding of how to live with the wilderness rather than against it guided their decisions about where to place their cabin, how to orient it for maximum warmth and minimum wind exposure, and how to integrate it into the natural landscape so it felt like it belonged rather than intruded. They worked from dawn to dusk, falling into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural for two people who'd known each other less than a week. Gideon's strength complemented Reba's wilderness skills, while her practical wisdom shaped his more ambitious plans into something achievable with their limited resources. When disagreements arose, and they did, with the frequency of two strong-willed people learning to share decisions, they talked them through with the patient courtesy of adults who understood that their individual success depended on their success as a team. I still think we need more insulation on the north wall, Reba said, as they took a break from notching logs for the cabin's frame. More insulation means more work and more materials, Gideon replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. We've got to balance what we want with what we can actually accomplish before winter. Winter up here isn't a suggestion, Gideon. It's a fact that'll kill you if you're not properly prepared for it. He looked at her thoughtfully, recognizing the voice of hard-won experience. You're right. Better to work harder now than freeze later. How much more insulation are we talking about? This pattern repeated itself throughout their building process. Gideon would propose something based on general construction principles. Reba would adjust it based on specific mountain conditions, and together they'd find a solution that drew on both their areas of expertise. The cabin that slowly took shape was neither purely functional nor purely crafted, but something in between, a structure that would protect them from the elements while remaining a place they'd actually want to live. In the evenings, as they sat by their fire, eating whatever game Reba had hunted or fish they'd caught from the stream, They began sharing the stories that people tell when they're deciding whether to trust each other with their deeper truths. Gideon spoke of his childhood in Ohio, his parents' farm that had failed during a particularly bad drought, his years of drifting westward in search of something he couldn't quite name. Reba told him about growing up wild after her mother died, learning to survive from mountain men and Indian women who saw her potential even when civilized society saw only oddity. "My father never knew what to do with me," she said one evening, her voice carrying the distant pain of old wounds that had healed crooked. "I think he loved me in his way, but he couldn't figure out how to raise a daughter who was stronger than most sons. When Jake came along, Pa finally had someone he understood. I became the one who did the work that needed doing, while Jake learned to be charming and useless." "Jake's weakness isn't your fault," Gideon said quietly. "Maybe not, but I enabled it for a long time, covered for him when he made bad choices, let him trade on my skills when his own weren't enough. Part of me thought that if I just worked hard enough, was useful enough, maybe he'd finally see me as worth protecting instead of worth trading away." Gideon was quiet for a moment, recognizing the particular pain of someone who'd loved unwisely and paid the price for it. "My father used to tell me that you can't earn love by being perfect. Either people love you for who you are, or they don't love you at all, they just love what you can do for them. Smart man, your father. In some ways. In others, he was as lost as the rest of us." As the days passed, their cabin began to look like a real home, rather than just a shelter. Gideon revealed an unexpected talent for detailed work-carving hinges from hardwood, fitting doors and windows, with the precision of someone who took pride in craftsmanship for its own sake. In his saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oiled leather, he kept a leather-bound journal where he recorded not just practical observations about weather and game movements, but reflections on human nature, fragments of poetry, and careful drawings of plants and animals they encountered. "I didn't know you were a scholar," Reba said one evening, finding him writing by firelight. "Not a scholar, just someone who thinks better when he writes things down." He showed her a page filled with his careful handwriting. "Been keeping journals since I learned to read. Helps me make sense of things, figure out what I really think about what's happening to me." She studied the page, her finger tracing lines of text that spoke of loneliness, hope, and the gradual recognition that he'd found something worth staying still for. "You write about me in there?" "Some, mostly about how you see things I miss, how you know things I need to learn, how being around you makes me feel like I'm finally moving towards something instead of just away from everything else." That night, as they lay in their separate bedrolls on opposite sides of their small fire, both of them stared up at stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air. They were still strangers in many ways, still learning the basic rhythms of sharing space and decisions and daily life. But they were also beginning to understand that what they'd started at Fort Bridger's auction yard might actually grow into something real and lastinga, partnership built on mutual respect rather than desperate need, shared work rather than romantic fantasy. "Gideon," Reba's voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah? Thank you for seeing me as worth taking a chance on, for working so hard to build something good up here, for treating me like a partner instead of a burden. Thank you for saying yes, for teaching me things I never would have learned on my own, for being brave enough to start over with a stranger." They were quiet for a while, listening to the stream murmur over its rocky bed and the distant sound of an owl calling from the pine forest that surrounded their valley. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more opportunities to learn whether they could truly build a life together in this beautiful, unforgiving place. But tonight, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they weren't alone. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made every task a test of endurance. But their cabin held strong against the mountain winds, and the careful preparations they'd made through the autumn month smoking meat, gathering and drying medicinal herbs, cutting enough firewood to last until spring proved sufficient to see them through the harshest season either had ever faced together. It was during those long winter evenings, when darkness fell by 4 o'clock, and the world outside became a realm of howling wind and driving snow, that Gideon began carving the chess set that would become one of their most treasured possessions. Working by firelight with tools designed for rougher work, he slowly shaped pieces from different woodsnites, from dark walnut, bishops from pale birch, pawns from sturdy oak. Each piece required hours of careful work, and each represented his growing understanding that this life they were building together was worth the investment of time and patience that created beautiful things. "You don't have to make them fancy," Reba said one evening, watching him work on the intricate details of a castle's battlements. "Simple pieces would work just as well." "They would," Gideon agreed, not looking up from his carving. "But we've got the time, and you deserve something beautiful. Besides, if we're going to be stuck inside together for the next 4 months, we might as well have a way to exercise our minds along with our bodies." The chess set revealed yet another layer of Gideon's character: his appreciation for strategy, his understanding that the best moves often required thinking several steps ahead, his respect for an opponent skilled enough to challenge him. Teaching Reba the game became one of their favorite ways to pass the long winter evenings, and she proved to be a quick learner with an intuitive grasp of tactics that often surprised him. "You're thinking like a hunter," he observed after she'd executed a particularly clever trap that cost him his queen. "Setting up the situation so your opponent moves exactly where you want them to move. Isn't that what chess is?" she replied, studying the board for her next move. "Understanding how your opponent thinks, knowing what they want, and using that knowledge to control the outcome." "It is. I just didn't expect you to master it so quickly. I've been reading people my whole life, Gideon. Had to, in order to survive. This is just reading patterns on a board instead of signs in the wilderness." Their conversations during those winter months ranged far beyond the practical matters of survival and daily life. Gideon shared his education, such as it was teaching Reba to read with greater fluency, helping her with mathematics and the broader concepts that formal schooling provided. In return, she taught him the deeper lessons of wilderness life. How to read weather patterns days in advance, which plants could heal and which could kill. How to move through dangerous country without leaving sign that would betray his presence. But perhaps more importantly, they learned to be comfortable with each other's silences. Reba had spent most of her adult life alone, and she sometimes needed space to think without the pressure of conversation. Gideon respected this, understanding that silence wasn't rejection, but simply another way of being together. Similarly, he had periods when his thoughts turned inward, when he needed to process experiences and emotions through writing in his journal or simply staring into the fire while his mind worked through complex feelings. One particularly fierce storm in January trapped them inside for 6 straight days, testing their ability to share a small space without driving each other to madness. They discovered that Reba had an unexpected gift for storytelling, weaving tales of her mountain adventures with the kind of vivid detail that made Gideon feel as if he'd been there himself. Her stories weren't boastful recountings of her own prowess, but rather careful observations about the way wild creatures behaved, the lessons that hardship taught, and the moments of unexpected beauty that made survival worthwhile. "Tell me about the grizzly," he said one evening as wind rattled their shutters and snow hissed against the cabin walls. "Which one? I've had encounters with several over the years." "The one Jake mentioned at the auction, the one you killed with just a knife." Reba was quiet for a long moment, her hands still as she considered whether to share that particular story. "It was during my second winter alone," she said finally. "I was maybe 19, thought I knew everything there was to know about mountain survival. I'd cached supplies in a cave about a day's walk from where I was wintering, and when I went to check on them, I found that a bear had moved in." She paused to add wood to the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. "Smart thing would have been to leave, find somewhere else to winter, let the bear have the cave and the supplies. But I was young and proud, and those supplies represented weeks of work. I convinced myself I could drive the bear off, claim what was mine. But it didn't work out that way. Bears don't much care about human property rights. This one was a big male, probably weighed twice what I did, and he'd been eating my cached food for weeks. He was feeling territorial, and I was feeling stubborn. When I tried to scare him off with noise and thrown rocks, he decided to teach me about the natural order of things. Gideon found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story despite knowing she'd obviously survived the encounter. How did you manage it? Luck, mostly, and the fact that I'd learned to think like prey instead of like a predator. When he charged, I didn't try to fight him head-on. I used his size and momentum against him. Got inside his reach, stayed low, kept moving. The knife work came later, when he was already off balance and confused about where I was and what I was doing. Weren't you terrified? Terrified, yes. But terror can make you sharp if you don't let it make you stupid. Fear kept me moving, kept me thinking, reminded me that one mistake would be my last mistake. Gideon studied her face in the firelight, seeing not the bearded mountain woman that others saw, but someone who'd faced death with courage and intelligence and emerged stronger for the experience. That's when you knew you could survive anything. That's when I knew I could survive alone. What I'm learning now is different how to survive together, how to let someone else care about what happens to me, how to care about what happens to someone else without losing myself in the process. Outside, the storm continued its assault on their small sanctuary, but inside, warmth and safety and growing intimacy created a world complete unto itself. They played chess by firelight, shared stories that revealed the depths of their individual experiences, and slowly began to understand that what they'd started as a partnership was transforming into something deeper and more complex. When spring finally arrived, melting the snow and filling their valley with the sound of running water and returning birds, they emerged from their winter hibernation changed. They moved together with the unconscious coordination of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, who could anticipate needs and responses, who'd discovered that sharing space could enhance rather than diminish individual strength. "We made it," Gideon said on the first warm morning, standing outside their cabin and breathing air that smelled of growing things rather than wood smoke and winter. "We did," Reba agreed, her hand finding his as naturally as water finds its level. "Now let's see what we can build together when the world opens up again." Spring brought with it the need for supplies and the inevitable return to human contact. Their winter stores had served them well, but they needed salt, sugar, ammunition, and the various metal goods that couldn't be fashioned by hand in a mountain cabin. More importantly, Gideon needed to establish some source of income. Their savings wouldn't last forever, and mountain life, while self-sufficient in many ways, still required occasional interaction with the cash economy of the growing West. The decision to venture into Millerville, a settlement 2 days' ride southeast of their valley, marked the first time Reba would face public scrutiny since their wedding at Fort Bridger. She spent the morning of their departure standing before their small mirror, trying to decide whether to make any concessions to conventional feminine appearance. "I could trim the beard," she said finally, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory. "Maybe braid my hair differently." Gideon looked up from packing their trade goods belts they'd accumulated over the winter, along with some of Reba's expert woodwork and a few bottles of the medicinal tinctures she'd prepared from mountain herbs. "You could," he said carefully, "but you don't have to, not for me and not for them. It might make things easier. It might, but it would also be you changing yourself to make other people more comfortable with who you are. Seems to me you've been doing that most of your life, and it hasn't made you particularly happy." She turned away from the mirror, her decision made. The woman who rode beside Gideon toward Millerville wore her beard with dignity, her hair braided in the practical style she preferred, her clothing chosen for durability and comfort rather than fashion. But she'd also sewn herself a new dress from fabric they'd acquired in their last trading expedition, a simple garment in dark blue wool that acknowledged her femininity without apologizing for her unconventional appearance. Millerville proved to be larger than either had expected, a growing community that served ranchers, miners, and the occasional travelers, heading toward more established settlements. The main street bustled with activity freight wagons loading supplies, cowboys on their way to or from distant ranches, merchants hawking everything from patent medicines to farm equipment. The stares began as soon as they rode into town, but they were different from the cruel mockery they'd faced at Fort Bridger. These were the looks of curiosity rather than malice, the natural human interest in something unusual rather than the deliberate cruelty of people looking for entertainment. Still, Reba felt the familiar tension that came with being the center of unwanted attention. "Remember," Gideon said quietly as they dismounted outside Harrison's general store, "we're here as equals, partners. You don't owe anyone explanations or apologies." The store's interior was dim and cluttered, filled with the mixed aromas of leather, tobacco, coffee, and the 1,000 other goods that frontier communities required for survival and comfort. Samuel Harrison, the proprietor, was a thin man in his 50s, with the careful demeanor of someone who'd learned to evaluate people quickly and accurately. "Folks," he said, nodding politely as they approached his counter, "what can I do for you today?" "We're looking to trade some goods and pick up supplies," Gideon replied, setting their bundle on the counter. "Pelts mostly, and some handmade items my wife produces." Harrison examined their offerings with the practiced eye of someone who'd been evaluating frontier goods for decades. The pelts were clearly well prepared, the fur thick and unmarked by poor handling. But it was Reba's woodwork that caught his attention, set of wooden bowls carved with intricate patterns, their surfaces polished to a warm glow that spoke of both skill and patience. "This is exceptional work," he said, running his fingers over the smooth curves of a bowl. "Haven't seen craftsmanship like this since my grandfather's time back in Pennsylvania." "Thank you," Reba replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I learned from a Shoshone woman who understood that useful things should also be beautiful." "Indeed they should." Harrison continued his examination, his professional interest clearly genuine. "I could easily sell these to folks looking for quality goods. Wedding gifts, special occasions, that sort of thing. Would you be interested in a regular arrangement? I could provide materials, you could provide the craftsmanship." The offer represented more than just potential income. It was recognition of Reba's skills as valuable in their own right, worthy of respect and compensation. For someone who'd spent most of her life being seen as a curiosity or a burden, the simple acknowledgement of her abilities carried emotional weight far beyond its economic value. "We'd be interested," Gideon said, recognizing the significance of the moment. "What kind of arrangements did you have in mind?" They spent the next hour negotiating terms that would allow Reba to work at her own pace while providing Harrison with a steady supply of high-quality goods. The arrangement would require monthly trips to town, but it would also provide them with reliable income and the satisfaction of work that was appreciated rather than merely tolerated. As they conducted their business, word of the unusual couple spread through Millerville's small community, but rather than attracting the hostile mockery they'd experienced at Fort Bridger, their presence generated the kind of cautious curiosity that frontier communities typically showed toward newcomers who seemed competent and self-sufficient. "You folks settling in the area?" asked Martha Collins, a rancher's wife who'd stopped by the store to examine Reba's woodwork. "Up in the mountains," Reba replied carefully. "We've got a place in one of the valleys north of here. Making it through the winter all right. That's hard country up there. We managed fine. The land's good if you understand how to work with it." Martha nodded approvingly. "Takes strength to survive up there, and skill. My husband always says the mountains don't suffer fools, but they'll reward folks who know what they're doing." The conversation continued in this vein: practical questions about mountain life, respectful interest in their homesteading efforts, the kind of acceptance that frontier communities offered to people who pulled their own weight and didn't cause trouble for their neighbors. It wasn't the warm welcome that a more conventional couple might have received, but it was something far more valuable: recognition as competent adults worthy of basic respect. That evening, as they camped beside a creek halfway home, Reba reflected on the day's events. "It was different than I expected," she said, stirring beans over their small fire. "Different how?" They looked at me like I was unusual, but not like I was a joke. Like I was someone they might not understand, but someone they could respect. That's because they could see what you can do, not just what you look like. Harrison recognized quality work when he saw it. Mrs. Collins could tell you knew something about surviving in hard country. They judged you by your abilities, not your appearance. Is that what you did, that first day at Fort Bridger? Gideon considered the question carefully. Partly, but mostly I saw someone being treated badly who deserved better. Someone with dignity and strength who was being mocked by people who couldn't match either quality. They sat in comfortable silence as stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow they would return to their valley, to the life they were building together in the mountains. But tonight they carried with them the knowledge that they could venture into the world when necessary, that they could find acceptance and opportunity among people willing to see past surface differences to recognize genuine worth. "I think I'm ready to be part of the world again," Reba said quietly. "Not the whole world, maybe, but the part that's willing to judge people fairly." "The world's lucky to have you in it," Gideon replied, even if it took them a while to figure that out. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, carried by a nervous young rider who'd clearly pushed his horse hard to reach their mountain valley. Gideon accepted the envelope. With growing unease, few people knew where they lived, and fewer still would go to the expense of hiring a courier to reach them. "Mr. Bell?" the rider asked, consulting a piece of paper from his saddlebag. "Gideon Bell, married to Reba Kinley?" "That's right. Got a letter for you from the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne. Fellow who sent it said it was urgent legal business." Gideon tipped the young man for his trouble and watched him ride away before opening the envelope. Inside, he found an official document bearing the seal of the Wyoming Territory, along with a shorter note written in a lawyer's careful hand. As he read, his face grew pale with understanding and concern. "What is it?" Reba asked, looking up from the garden where she'd been tending their growing vegetables. "Jake's dead," Gideon said quietly. "Died 3 weeks ago in a gambling house in Denver, but that's not the worst of it." He handed her the letter, watching her face as she read the lawyer's explanation. According to the document, Jake Kinley had died owing substantial debts to several dangerous men, including members of the Carruthers gang, the same group that had confronted them at Fort Bridger the morning after their wedding. More troubling still, Jake's sale of his sister had never been legally formalized. Without proper documentation, their marriage might be considered invalid, and Reba might be viewed as Jake's property, subject to seizure by his creditors. "This can't be right," Reba said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "A person can't be owned as collateral for gambling debts. This isn't the South before the war." "Legally, you're correct," Gideon replied. "But these aren't people who care much about legal niceties. They're looking for ways to recover what Jake owed them, and if they can convince a corrupt judge that you're valuable property rather than a free citizen, they might be able to claim you." The implications hung heavy between them. Everything they'd built together, their home, their growing business relationship with Harrison's store, their carefully constructed life in the mountains, could be threatened by Jake's final act of selfishness. That afternoon, a second visitor arrived at their valley, this one considerably less welcome than the young courier. Marcus Webb rode up to their cabin with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to delivering unpleasant news. He was well dressed for the frontier, his horse expensive, his gear speaking of someone with resources and connections. "Mr. and Mrs. Bell," he said, dismounting and removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain business interests in Denver who had financial arrangements with the late Jake Kinley." "We heard about Jake's death," Gideon said carefully, "but his debts aren't our concern." "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken." Webb withdrew a folder from his saddlebags, displaying documents with an air of legal authority. "You see, Mr. Kinley used his sister as collateral for several substantial loans. Upon his death, those debts transfer to his estate, which consists primarily of one Reba Kinley, also known as Bearjaw." "That's ridiculous," Reba said, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife at her belt. "I'm a married woman, not property to be traded around by dead men." Are you, though? Webb's smile was cold and calculating. Because according to my research, your so-called marriage was never properly documented. No legal ceremony, no official witnesses, no proper filing with territorial authorities. Which means, in the eyes of the law, you're still Jake Kinley's sister, subject to the terms of his agreements. Gideon felt ice forming in his stomach as he recognized the trap that Jake's final weakness had created for them. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Webb? My clients are reasonable men. They understand that collecting debts in full isn't always possible. They're willing to accept Miss Kinley's services in lieu of the cash that Mr. Kinley owed. She'll work for them until the debt is satisfied, probably 2 or 3 years, assuming she proves valuable enough to justify her keep. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind moving through the pine trees that surrounded their valley. Reba's face had gone very still, her eyes holding the dangerous calm that Gideon had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "And if we refuse?" Gideon asked. "Then my clients will be forced to pursue other remedies. They have friends in the territorial government, judges who understand the importance of honoring legitimate business contracts. They also have associates who specialize in collecting difficult debts through more direct methods." Webb remounted his horse, his message delivered with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "You have 1 week to consider their generous offer. After that, they'll assume you've chosen the more difficult path." As Webb rode away, Gideon and Reba stood in the silence of their valley, both understanding that their peaceful life had just been shattered by the ghost of Jake's irresponsibility. "There's something I need to tell you," Gideon said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Something I should have mentioned before, but never found the right time." He walked to their cabin and returned with a small leather pouch that he'd kept hidden in their gear. From it, he withdrew a tarnished metal badgia, 5-pointed star with U.S. Marshal engraved in simple letters. "I wasn't always just a drifting cowboy," he said, the badge heavy in his palm. "For 8 years, I wore this badge for the territorial government. Served warrants, tracked fugitives, brought order to places where the law was more suggestion than reality." Reba stared at the badge, understanding immediately why he'd kept this part of his past hidden. "You were a lawman. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I was trying to leave that life behind. I'd seen too much violence, made too many enemies, lost too many friends to bullets and bad decisions. When I married you, I wanted to be someone different, someone who built things instead of tearing them down, someone who protected what mattered instead of constantly fighting other people's battles. But you still know how these things work, the legal system, the territorial government, men like Webb and his clients. I know them better than I'd like to admit. The Carruthers gang isn't just a group of gamblers and debt collectors. They're criminals with enough money and connections to buy protection from corrupt officials. If they want you, they'll find ways to make it legal, at least on paper." Reba picked up the badge, feeling its weight and understanding what it represented, not just Gideon's hidden past, but perhaps their only hope of fighting back against the forces that threatened to destroy their life together. "What would Marshal Gideon Bell do in this situation?" she asked. Marshal Bell would gather evidence, build a legal case, work through proper channels to ensure justice was served. And what would Gideon Bell, mountain man and husband, do? Gideon looked at their cabin, their garden, their valley, everything they'd built together with their own hands and their own hopes. He'd fight. Whatever it took, however dangerous it became, he'd fight to protect what mattered most. "Then that's what we'll do," Reba said, handing him back the badge. "We'll fight them with law when we can, and with everything else when we have to." That evening, as they sat by their fire, planning their response to Webb's ultimatum, they both understood that their quiet life in the mountains was ending. Whatever came next would test not just their courage and resourcefulness, but the strength of the bond they'd forged through shared work and mutual respect. "Are you afraid?" Reba asked, as stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Terrified," Gideon admitted, "but not of them. I'm afraid of losing what we've built here, of losing you, of going back to being the kind of man who solves problems with violence instead of wisdom." "Then we'll have to be smarter than they are," she said, her voice carrying the quiet determination that had carried her through every challenge life had presented. "We'll have to prove that what we've built together is stronger than what they're trying to tear apart." The badge lay between them on the ground, catching firelight like a promise of the battle to come. The week that followed Marcus Webb's visit transformed their peaceful valley into a fortress of preparation and grim determination. Gideon's martial training emerged like muscle memory, his mind automatically cataloguing defensive positions, escape routes, and the tactical advantages their mountain location provided. But this wasn't just about strategy, it was about protecting everything they'd built together, and that knowledge gave their preparations an intensity that went beyond professional competence. "They'll come at dawn," Gideon said, studying the approaches to their valley through his field glasses. "It's what I'd do it when people are least prepared, when the light's tricky and targets are confused about what they're seeing." Reba nodded, her hands busy with preparations that drew on decades of wilderness survival. She'd spent the past 3 days creating strategic supply caches throughout their valley: food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies hidden in locations that would remain accessible even if their cabin became untenable. How many men will they bring? Webb mentioned associates who specialize in collection work. That usually means 4 to 6 men, enough to handle serious resistance, but not so many that they can't move quietly. They'll be armed and experienced, but they'll also be overconfident. Men like that usually underestimate people they consider primitive. That could work in our favor. It will, if we're smart about how we use it. Their defensive preparations revealed the depth of skills both had acquired during their individual years of hardship. Gideon's law enforcement experience had taught him how violent men thought, how they approached problems, and what tactical mistakes they typically made when dealing with unfamiliar terrain. Reba's wilderness expertise provided knowledge of how to use their mountain environment as an ally which approaches could be blocked, where ambushes could be set, how weather and terrain could multiply the effectiveness of 2 defenders against superior numbers. But their most important preparation was emotional rather than tactical. On the 4th evening after Webb's visit, they sat together beside their fire, sharing what might be their last peaceful moments in the valley that had become their sanctuary. "I need you to understand something," Gideon said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "If this goes badly, if something happens to me, you run. Don't try to fight them alone. Don't sacrifice yourself for revenge. Get out of here and start over somewhere else." "And I need you to understand something," Reba replied, her green eyes reflecting firelight and absolute determination. "I'm not running. Not from you, not from this place, not from the life we've built together. Whatever happens, we face it together." "Reba." "No." Her voice cut through his protest with quiet authority. "I spent most of my life running from people who wanted to use me, control me, or turn me into something I wasn't. I'm done running. This is my home. You're my husband, and I'll be damned if I let Jake's weakness destroy what we've created." Gideon looked at her across the fire, seeing not the oddity that others had mocked, but a woman whose strength had been forged in circumstances that would have broken lesser souls. "Then we stand together. We stand together." The next morning brought visitors they hadn't expected: Samuel Harrison from the general store in Millerville, accompanied by Martha Collins, her husband Tom, and 3 other townspeople Gideon and Reba recognized from their trading expeditions. "Heard you folks might be having some trouble," Harrison said, dismounting from his horse with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to long rides. "Thought you could use some friendly company." Tom Collins, a rancher whose weathered face spoke of decades dealing with harsh country and dangerous situations, nodded toward the strategic positions Gideon had been preparing. "Word gets around about men like Webb and his associates. Folks in Millerville don't much appreciate outsiders coming into our area making threats against people who've proven themselves to be good neighbors." The unexpected support brought both relief and concern. These were good people offering help they didn't owe, but they were also civilians who might be walking into a situation more dangerous than they understood. "I appreciate the thought," Gideon said carefully, But these men aren't ordinary troublemakers. They're professionals who won't hesitate to hurt anyone who gets in their way. Which is exactly why you shouldn't face them alone, Martha Collins replied, with the practical determination that frontier women cultivated as a survival skill. Besides, we're not helpless townspeople. Tom fought in the war, Harrison served as a territorial ranger, and the rest of us have dealt with hostile Indians, claim jumpers, and every other kind of trouble the frontier can throw at people. Their offer of assistance wasn't charity or misguided heroism, it was the mutual aid that frontier communities extended to members who'd proven their worth. Gideon and Reba had established themselves as valuable members of the larger community through honest dealing, quality work, and the kind of self-sufficiency that frontier life demanded. Now that community was responding to protect its own. "What exactly are you proposing?" Reba asked. "Nothing fancy," Tom Collins replied. "Just evening the odds a bit. You know this valley. We know how to handle ourselves in a fight. And together we might convince Webb's associates that collecting this particular debt isn't worth the cost." The tactical discussion that followed revealed capabilities Gideon hadn't expected. Harrison had indeed served as a territorial ranger, giving him experience with exactly the kind of men they were likely to face. Tom Collins's war service had included action at Gettysburg and several other major engagements, providing him with combat leadership skills that peaceful ranching had kept sharp rather than dulled. The other townspeople brought their own mix of military experience, frontier toughness, and the kind of practical competence that surviving in hard country required. By evening, they developed a plan that multiplied their defensive capabilities while minimizing risk to the volunteers who'd come to help. The townspeople would position themselves to block escape routes and provide covering fire if needed, while Gideon and Reba handled the direct confrontation with Webb's men. It wasn't perfect, but it gave them fighting chances they wouldn't have had alone. As the sun set on what they all knew would be their last peaceful evening, Gideon found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. 18 months ago, he'd been a drifting cowboy with no ties, no prospects, and no reason to care about tomorrow. Now he was surrounded by people willing to risk their lives to help him protect what mattered most. "Strange how things work out," he said to Reba, as they checked their weapons one final time. "How so?" "That day at Fort Bridger, when I stepped forward to marry you, I thought I was just helping someone who deserved better treatment. I had no idea I was starting something that would change everything about who I am and what I care about." "Maybe that's how the best things happen," she replied, loading shells into the shotgun she'd chosen as her primary weapon. "Not because people plan them, but because someone decides to do the right thing, even when they don't know where it will lead. Do you ever regret it? Saying yes to a stranger, giving up your independence, getting pulled into this mess because of Jake's mistakes?" Reba looked around their valley at the cabin they'd built together, the garden they'd planted, the life they'd created through shared work and mutual respect. "I regret Jake's weakness and the trouble it's brought us, but I don't regret anything else. For the first time in my life, I have something worth fighting for that goes beyond just surviving another day." In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound echoing off the mountain walls that surrounded their valley. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger, testing everything they'd built together. But tonight, they had each other. They had allies who'd chosen to stand with them, and they had the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any risk to protect. Gideon pinned his marshal's badge to his shirt for the first time in over a year, feeling the weight of authority and responsibility it represented. Tomorrow he would be both the lawman he'd once been and the man he'd become, someone who understood that justice sometimes required more than legal procedures, and that protecting what mattered most was worth whatever it cost. "They're coming," Reba said quietly, pointing toward the distant glow of campfires on the southern ridge. "Probably planning to move at first light." "Then we'd better get some rest," Gideon replied. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As they settled into position for what might be their final night together, both understood that the peaceful chapter of their lives was ending. Whatever emerged from tomorrow's confrontation would be tested by fire, tempered by violence, and forged into something stronger than what they'd started with if they survived to see it. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountain valley, mist rising from the stream and clinging to the pine trees like smoke from distant fires. Reba had painted her face with war paint made from mountain clay and crushed berries not from any Indian tradition, but from her own understanding that warfare was as much about psychology as tactics. The red and black patterns that covered her cheeks and forehead transformed her already intimidating appearance into something that would unsettle men who thought they understood what they were facing. "You look like something out of their worst nightmares," Gideon said approvingly, as they took their positions behind the natural rock formations that guarded the valley's main approach. "That's the point. Let them wonder what kind of people they're really dealing with." The first sign of trouble came as expected, 6 riders moving down the ridge trail with the careful confidence of men who'd done this kind of work before. Marcus Webb rode in the center of the group, his expensive clothes and equipment marking him as someone who gave orders rather than took risks. The others had the lean, watchful look of professional gunmen, their weapons worn with the casual familiarity that spoke of frequent use. From their concealed position, Gideon could see that Webb's men had made the mistake he'd hoped, for they were approaching as if they expected to intimidate civilians rather than fight experienced opponents. Their formation was designed for show rather than tactical effectiveness, and they'd chosen the most obvious route into the valley rather than scouting for alternatives. "Harrison, you in position?" Gideon called softly. "Ready on the south trail," came the whispered reply from the former ranger's hiding place among the aspens. "Collins, north approach is covered. They won't get past us if they try to circle around." Webb's party reached the valley floor and rode toward the cabin with the swaggering confidence of men who expected their reputation to do most of their work for them. When they were 50 yards from the building, Gideon stepped out from behind his rock cover, his marshal's badge catching the morning light. "That's far enough," he called, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You're on private property, and you're not welcome here." Webb reined in his horse, his face showing surprise at the sight of the badge. "Marshal Bell, is it? I was told you were just a drifting cowboy who'd gotten lucky with an unusual woman." "I'm a lot of things, Webb. Right now, I'm a federal marshal telling you to turn around and ride out of this valley. I'm afraid I can't do that. I have legitimate business with Miss Kinley regarding her brother's debts. Her name is Mrs. Bell, and her brother's debts died with him. She's a free citizen under the protection of territorial law, and I'm ordering you to leave her alone." One of Webb's men, a thin gunfighter with nervous eyes and quick hands, shifted restlessly in his saddle. "Boss, this is taking too long. Let's just take her and sort out the legal details later." "Patience, Morrison. Marshal Bell is about to discover that his badge doesn't carry much weight when he's outnumbered 6-1 in the middle of nowhere." That's when Reba stepped out from her own concealment, her war paint and imposing presence causing several of the horses to shy nervously. She carried her shotgun with casual competence, and her green eyes held the kind of calm that came from having faced death before and survived. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying across the valley floor, "he's not outnumbered at all." Harrison emerged from the tree line to their south, his rifle trained on Webb's party. Tom Collins appeared on the northern ridge, followed by the other townspeople who'd volunteered to help defend what they considered part of their community. What had seemed like a simple collection job suddenly looked like a potential massacre for the wrong side. "You made a mistake, Webb," Gideon said, his hand resting on his pistol but not yet drawing it. "You assumed we were isolated, helpless, without friends or resources. You forgot that good people tend to attract other good people, while men like you only inspire fear and hatred." Webb's face had gone pale as he realized how badly he'd miscalculated the situation. "This isn't over, Bell. My employers have resources you can't imagine. They'll find ways to make your life very difficult." "Your employers can go to hell," Reba said flatly. "And if they send more men like you, they'll get the same reception." Morrison, the nervous gunfighter, was reaching for his weapon when Tom Collins's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I wouldn't do that, son." I've got you dead to rights from up here, and I don't miss what I aim at." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. 6 professional criminals faced down by 2 mountain dwellers and a handful of townspeople should have been an easy victory, but the tactical situation had turned completely against Webb's party. "This isn't how this was supposed to go," Morrison muttered, his hand frozen halfway to his gun. "It never is," Gideon replied. "That's why bullies usually lose when they finally meet people willing to stand up to them." The standoff stretched taut as wire, everyone understanding that the next few seconds would determine whether this ended in negotiation or bloodshed. Morrison broke first. Whether from nerves, overconfidence, or simple stupidity, he clawed for his pistol with the desperate speed of a man who'd realized his situation was hopeless but couldn't accept it. His draw was fast, professional fast, but Tom Collins had been waiting for exactly that movement from his elevated position among the rocks. The crack of Collins's rifle echoed off the valley walls, and Morrison pitched sideways from his saddle, his unfired weapon spinning away into the grass. The horses reared and plunged, their riders fighting to control mounts made frantic by the sudden violence and the scent of blood. "Next man who reaches for a gun joins him," Collins called from his perch. "I've got 5 more shots, and I don't plan to waste any of them." Webb's remaining men found themselves in the nightmare scenario that every professional gunfighter dreaded, caught in crossfire, with no cover, their tactical advantage evaporated, facing opponents who'd proven they were willing and able to kill. The smart ones raised their hands. The stubborn ones looked to Webb for orders that weren't coming. "Stand down," Gideon commanded, his own weapon now drawn and trained on Webb. "You're outgunned, outmaneuvered, and out of options. Surrender now, and you might live to see tomorrow." But Webb wasn't finished. Desperation or pride or simple refusal to accept defeat drove him to make one final play. He spurred his horse toward Reba, perhaps thinking that her imposing size made her a slower target, perhaps hoping to grab a hostage who could change the balance of power. He discovered his mistake too late. Reba's shotgun boomed once, the heavy charge catching Webb's horse in the chest and sending both rider and mount crashing to the ground in a tangle of thrashing limbs and screaming pain. Webb rolled clear, dazed but still reaching for his pistol, when Reba's second barrel spoke with the finality of judgment. The silence that followed was broken only by the whimpering of wounded horses and the distant echo of gunshots rolling back from the mountain walls. Webb lay motionless in the grass, his expensive clothes already darkening with blood, his schemes and threats ended as abruptly as they'd begun. Of his original party, 2 were dead, 1 was wounded and clearly finished fighting, and the remaining 2 sat their horses with raised hands and the pale faces of men who just watched their world change in ways they didn't understand. "Drop your weapons," Gideon ordered, his marshal's voice carrying the authority of law, backed by superior force. "Dismount slowly, keep your hands visible, and maybe you'll live long enough to ride out of here." The surrender proceeded with the mechanical efficiency of men who'd done this before from the other side. Weapons clattered to the ground, hands remained carefully visible, and the survivors waited for whatever judgment their captors might render. Harrison emerged from the tree line, moving with the careful alertness of someone who'd been in enough fights to know they weren't over until the last enemy was secured. The other townspeople maintained their positions, weapons ready, understanding that overconfidence had killed more victorious fighters than enemy bullets. "What do we do with them?" Martha Collins asked, her rifle still trained on the survivors, but her voice carrying the practical concern of someone dealing with an unexpected problem. "We give them a choice," Gideon replied, studying the men who'd come to destroy his life and learning something about himself in the process. The marshal he'd once been would have arrested them, built legal cases, worked through proper channels. The man he'd become understood that sometimes justice required more direct solutions. "You can ride back to Denver," he told the survivors, "and explain to your employers that Reba Bell is under federal protection, that any further attempts to collect imaginary debts will be met with lethal force, and that Wyoming territory isn't a safe place for their kind of business. Or you can stay here and join your friends in unmarked graves. Your choice. The men looked at their dead associates, at the determined faces surrounding them, at the mountain wilderness that stretched endlessly in every direction. The calculation was simple enough for even professional criminals to understand. "We'll take your message back," one of them said, his voice hoarse with fear and the bitter taste of defeat. "But they won't like it. These people don't forget, and they don't forgive." "Neither do we," Reba said, her war paint giving her words an additional weight that made hardened gunmen flinch. "Tell your employers that if they send more men, we'll kill them too. Tell them that some debts can't be collected, and some people can't be owned." As the survivors mounted their horses and rode away, carrying their wounded companion and the news of their failure, the defenders of the valley began to understand what they'd accomplished. They'd faced professional violence with amateur courage and won. More importantly, they'd proven to themselves and their community that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The wedding quilt appeared as if by magic. Martha Collins and the other women had been working on it in secret for weeks, waiting for the right moment to present it. Now, with the threat ended and their friends proven worthy of such a gift, they spread it across the grass like a banner of acceptance and love. "For your home," Martha said simply, "from people who've learned to see you as you really are." 3 years later, Gideon and Reba Bell stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the valley that had become not just their home, but a sanctuary for others who'd found themselves cast out by a world that valued conformity over character. The trading post they'd built served travelers heading through the mountain passes, while the small collection of cabins scattered throughout the valley housed people who'd learned that acceptance could be found in the most unexpected places. "Looks like we'll have a full table again tonight," Reba said, nodding toward the smoke rising from chimneys throughout their little community. The Henderson family from the North Cabin, old Pete from down by the creek, and those 2 brothers who showed up last week. The ones running from something back in Missouri. The same ones. Martha Collins vouched for them when she stopped by on her way to Fort Bridger. Says they're decent men who got on the wrong side of some powerful people for helping escaped slaves make it to Canada. Gideon nodded, understanding how easily good people could find themselves branded as criminals for doing what their conscience demanded. Their valley had become known throughout the territory as a place where people's past mattered less than their present character, where judgment was based on what someone contributed rather than what made them different. The dinner table that evening stretched nearly the length of their main room. Accommodated guests whose stories might have shocked respectable society, but who'd found acceptance among people who understood that survival often required unconventional choices. There was Sarah Martinez, a Mexican woman whose husband had been killed by claim jumpers, leaving her to raise 3 children alone in country that questioned her right to exist. There was James Whitehorse, a mixed-blood Cheyenne who'd been educated in Eastern schools, but found himself welcome nowhere too, Indian for white society, too white for his tribe. There was Rebecca Thompson, a widow whose insistence on running her own business had scandalized the Kansas town where she'd tried to settle. "Pass the potatoes, Bearjaw," old Pete called from his end of the table, using Reba's old nickname with the affection of someone who'd earned the right to tease her. "Call me Mrs. Bell at my own table, you old coot," she replied, but her smile took the sting out of the words. These were their people now, the misfits, the outcasts, the people who didn't quite fit anywhere else, but who'd found ways to build meaningful lives on the margins of acceptable society. They worked hard, supported each other through difficulties, and asked no questions about pasts that everyone understood might be complicated. After dinner, as was their custom, Gideon brought out the carved chess set and challenged whoever felt brave enough to face him. Tonight it was James Whitehorse, whose formal education had included strategy games and whose natural intelligence made him a formidable opponent. "You're improving," Gideon observed as James executed a complicated gambit that cost Gideon his queen. "Good teachers make good students," James replied, studying the board for his next move. "Besides, I've learned that survival often depends on thinking several moves ahead. True enough. Though sometimes it also depends on knowing when to abandon your original plan and improvise something completely different. Reba listened to their conversation while mending clothes by lamplight, her skilled hands working automatically while her mind wandered over the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who'd stood on Fort Bridge's auction platform, enduring mockery and humiliation, seemed like someone from another lifetime. This woman was respected, valued, surrounded by people who appreciated her strengths and accepted her differences. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked Gideon later, as they prepared for bed in the privacy of their own room. The wandering, the freedom to just pack up and move on whenever things got complicated. "Sometimes," he admitted, hanging his marshal's badge on the peg where it now lived, permanently not, hidden away like a shameful secret, but displayed as one part of the man he'd become. "But I've learned there's a difference between freedom and aimlessness. Having something worth staying for doesn't make you trapped, it makes you rooted." "And the violence? The need to use your gun to protect what we'd built?" Gideon was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had troubled him during the dark hours after their confrontation with Webb's men. "I won't pretend it didn't change me. Taking life, even in defense of everything I care about, leaves marks that don't fade. But I've made peace with it. Sometimes good people have to do hard things to protect what matters most." Through their window, they could see lights in the other cabins scattered throughout their valley, each one representing lives that had found safety and purpose in this unlikely community. Tomorrow would bring the usual Challenger supplies to gather, visitors to evaluate, the endless work of maintaining buildings and relationships that made their life possible. But tonight, they could rest in the knowledge that they'd built something lasting and worthwhile. "Gideon." "Yes?" "Thank you for seeing me as worth taking a chance on, for staying when things got difficult, for helping me understand that being different doesn't mean being alone. Thank you for saying yes, for teaching me that home isn't a place, it's the people you choose to build a life with." In the distance, a wolf howled to its pack, the sound echoing off the mountain walls that sheltered their valley. But inside their cabin, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and love honestly earned, Gideon and Reba Bell settled into sleep with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd found exactly what they'd been searching for, even when they hadn't known they were searching for it. Years later, travelers through the mountain passes would tell stories of the bearded woman and the quiet marshal who'd built a sanctuary for misfits and outcasts in a hidden valley. Their shared gravestone, carved from local granite and inscribed with the words, "Together in life, together in death," would become a landmark for people seeking proof that love could indeed conquer the cruelest judgments of an unforgiving world. But that was still far in the future. Tonight, they had each other, they had their community, and they had the unshakable knowledge that some transformations last forever.